Sup people, welcome to 1000 Words. My name is Radu, I'm a street photographer from Romania, and today we're reviewing the Konica Hexanon AR 100mm f2.8. Yeah, it's a bit of an unusual focal length for me, not something I usually or basically ever shoot. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of this video, I want to talk to you about the miracle juice I'm having today. Wonderful, wonderful double dry hopped New England IPA from Hop Hooligans. So cheers fellows, and welcome to what I guess is season 3 of my vintage lens review series. Let's drink to that.
Cheers.
Quite a fitting name. It is actually quite juicy, very citrusy, very good. And the lens I'm reviewing today, oddly enough, is no longer in my possession. That is for two reasons. First of all, because it's the last lens I used before trying my hand at completely switching my workflow to autofocus lenses. You all know how that went. See the previous video. Spoiler alert, it didn't go well, so I'm back to vintage lenses. And the second reason why I no longer own that lens is because I didn't really like it. And I didn't like it for yet another two reasons. First up is the focal length. I had quite some trouble with getting used to using that lens. It's really too long for me. I think I top out at 85mm where I'm comfortable shooting. Of course, practice makes anything doable, but I really didn't have enough time to practice with it, nor enough will or motivation, because it's really not something I enjoy doing. Shooting this long I find to be quite cumbersome, really unnatural to me. It's really long, and admittedly, while I understand this focal length is not usually the type of lens you take for street photography, and it's very much more so geared towards portraits. Even if we're talking about portraits, I much prefer something like an 85mm. Furthermore, if we're talking about image quality, and we will get a bit more in-depth about image quality, and I'll also show you some images, I do want to stress the fact that I came in shooting this lens with the same expectations I always do if we're talking about vintage lenses. And these expectations are not about pristine image quality, are not about sharpness. It's not even on the top of my list. Sharpness is really something that I think about further down the list when we talk about priorities. What I'm after is a bit of character. What I'm after is some charm, something that makes me go wow, something that tickles my fancy in a way that assuredly modern lenses don't. So it was quite surprising to learn that while very much vintage lens as far as the era it was made in is concerned, because it's a late 60s lens, early 70s. My variant was even more so one of those lenses that was made before Konica introduced rubber around the focusing ring, so it was an all-metal lens, one of the earlier variants. It was still quite modern in the way it rendered images. I found it completely and utterly devoid of any sort of personality and character. And as far as I'm concerned, if we're talking about vintage lenses, I find that to be a flaw. Couple that with the fact that I was really having a bit of a trouble shooting 100mm. It's probably, hopefully now, easy to understand why I let go of it. Now, as far as specs go, it's a pretty standard 35mm full frame lens with the Konica AR mount, the proprietary Konica mount, with a 24.4 degree angle of view on 35 millimeters, with an optical construction of 5 elements in 4 groups, a diaphragm that can do automatic, 6 slightly rounded aperture blades, close minimum focusing distance of 1 meter, which is yet again quite standard for 100 millimeters. It's an entirely manual focus lens. Obviously enough, seeing how it's a late 60s, early 70s lens, weighing in at 290 grams with a filter thread of 55 millimeters. Now, on the plus side, this lens was excellently built, really compact. I'm really sorry I can't show it to you, but you have to take my word for it. My copy was in practically mint condition. Everything about that lens inspired confidence. It was extremely well built. It felt great in the hand. It was compact enough for a 100 millimeter lens. Balancing really nicely on my Sony A7R III, also balancing really nicely on my Konica Auto Reflex T3 film camera. I did shoot a few images on film, but mostly I shot this on digital, where it performed brilliantly. Now, as far as sharpness goes, this lens really surprised me for once in a positive manner, because it was really sharp. As sharp as a lot of modern lenses can get. Sure, slightly soft at f2.8, but once you stop it down, it really can come into its own. And most optical flaws and imperfections, the little it does have, because sadly enough it has very little, are resolved and practically non-existent. Colors are well rendered, they're lively and vivid, they pop just enough to be sufficiently saturated, although they do benefit from a bit of massaging in post-production. As far as portrait focal length lenses go, this lens is quite suitable for that, because on the one hand it's sufficiently sharp to render enough detail in resolution, and on the other hand it's sufficiently soft and gentle in order to benefit and flatter your subjects. Colors are slightly on the colder side of the spectrum, but usually sufficiently neutral in order to easily achieve a very good white balance even on auto settings. Now, something I found quite interesting with this lens, and surprisingly enough, especially considering its focal length, I mean, it's a pretty long lens. It's a short telephoto, but even compared to shorter still telephotos like an 85, I was surprised to find I had a really difficult time in getting good blur out of this lens. Even when managing my distances, shooting up close to my subject with the foreground way back, I really couldn't make this lens render a pretty blur. It almost felt like this lens is not even a 2.8, but rather something like an f4. I was always surprised how little blur this lens makes, and the blur this lens makes is really nothing to write home about. It's bland, it's characterless, it's soulless, it's got no personality, and God knows I tried. However, on the positive side, this lens is, yet again, sharp, contrasty, punchy. This lens exhibits absolutely negligible and really minor geometric distortions, something that is easily resolvable in post-production. It's sharp. Yes, I'm repeating myself, but it's worth mentioning because this is the main attribute of this lens. Tones are represented really nicely. There's a smooth, gradual transition from the dark shadows into the midtones and into the highlights. However, I found that it's really prone to flares. While long lenses usually are, this definitely would benefit from a lens hood, something I didn't use, but it can easily flare in some circumstances, because in others it seems to behave quite well. The gist of things is this lens is generally a solid performer. Now, what I deem to be flaws and shortcomings, I'm sure other photographers will consider to be positives, because different people look for different things in their tools. I, for one, look for character and soul, I'm looking for peculiarities, I'm after imperfections. I want something to be just tiny tad different from everything else out there. Sadly, this lens didn't provide me with that. It was too good, entirely too good. It's entirely too tame. It's very mild-mannered. It's a lens that can perform. It's a lens that can be used commercially and professionally, but if you're looking for something that's going to wow you with soul and personality, this is not it. And I'm a bit of a Konica fan. I really love me Konica glass, so much so that this is a bit of an anecdote. I'm in the process of buying back a couple of lenses I sold to a friend. That should tell you just how much I love Konica glass, and it's the 51.4 and the 41.8. So yeah, as a Konica fanboy, this was a bit of a letdown, and I feel it's kind of weird to say this because most images I took with this lens are keepers. However, at the same time, it's a lens I easily let go, no remorse whatsoever, because if we're talking about character and soul, this lens has none. It's a workhorse, sure enough, it's a tool, a good one at that, but pretty barren, pretty sterile, if you ask me. I think the images did well to portray that. I wanted to make this video because I had put in the work, so it felt like a waste not to. And also because there is really just entirely too little content on the internet regarding this lens. And for history's sake, I think people should know about it. If you're after something that performs well, almost on par with modern lenses, go for it. If you're looking for soul and character, you might want to skip this lens. Now, this has basically been all. I have been Radu. This has been a pretty good beer. I think I'm hankering for a burger right about now. This has been 1,000 words. Until next time, farewell.